Thank you for the invitation. When we started work on cannabinoids more than 50 years ago, very, very few groups were interested. Things have changed, and they have changed for the simple reason summarized by Becker and Kunos, two researchers at NIH in Washington. They have published that modulating endocannabinoid activity may have therapeutic potential in almost all diseases affecting humans. I doubt whether we can say this about any other system. And that's the reason that many groups look at the activity of endocannabinoids or of the plant cannabinoids from various aspects. Now, we have worked on three different phases, types of cannabinoid research. One of them is on the plant cannabinoid. Second one is the endocannabinoid, anandamide and 2-AG. And more recently, over the last few years, in additional anandamide-like compounds. When we started work on the plant cannabinoids, essentially only two compounds have been isolated, cannabidiol and THC. Cannabinol had also been seen, but I'm not sure that cannabinol is a natural product. Anyway, cannabidiol, as you can see here, and THC are very closely related. They have essentially the same structure, except THC has 3 rings, cannabidiol has only 2 rings, and they're completely different in their activity. While THC, as we well know, causes the effects that everybody associates with cannabis, cannabidiol essentially is a compound that is being used today for a long list of medical reasons. Surprisingly, the plant actually doesn't synthesize either THC or CBD. It synthesizes their precursors, their acids. The plant synthesizes cannabidiolic acid. It synthesizes tetrahydrocannabinolic acid. As a matter of fact, there are 2 acids. There are 2 THC acids. You can see here, and this depends on the position of the carboxyl group. Here is the carboxyl group here, and the carboxyl group here. And these compounds are not stable. They slowly convert into cannabidiol from cannabidiolic acid or THC from THC acid. And these compounds have not been investigated very thoroughly because they are not stable. And scientists don't like to work with unstable products because we don't know whether the effects seen are due to the compound itself or to a degradation product in the body. We were able recently to stabilize CBD acid by making a methyl ester, and this is putting a methyl group on the acid, and we have been able to look at the activity of this acid derivative. And together with a Canadian group, we found that it reduces depression in 2 animal models. It lowers pain with another Canadian group. So this particular compound, which is present in quite large amounts in cannabis, in the plant, is of considerable interest, and I assume that it will be used for one of these effects that we see, whether it's depression or whether it's pain. Most of the work that has been published actually is, of course, not on the acid, but on cannabidiol itself. I will not go into details. There are hundreds of papers on CBD action. Basically, it works on inflammation and epilepsy, on diabetes type 1, on graft-versus-host disease. A few words on epilepsy. We did, in collaboration with the group in South America, some initially work on mice and rats, and we saw that it is pretty active in models of epilepsy in these animal models. And then we went into a clinical study. We had 15 epileptic patients that were not being helped by the existing drugs at that time. They received 200 to 300 milligrams per day of cannabidiol for quite a long time, 4.5 months. And my colleagues in South America found that 4 patients out of 8 remained completely free of seizures. 3 patients had partial improvement, and only 1 patient had no improvement. With the placebo patients, of course, we saw essentially no change. This was published, as you can see the date here, about 40 years ago, but nothing happened for nearly 30 years. We could have helped a lot of epileptic patients over these 30 years. But about 10 or 12 years ago, additional groups got interested, and a major clinical trial was done by a British company. The trial was done in the US, and they found that it is indeed very active in certain epilepsy states. And now CBD has been approved as a drug for certain epileptic conditions. I also mentioned graft versus host disease. Well, this is actually a disease caused by medicine. There are certain diseases where a bone marrow transplant is needed, and it is very helpful in certain cancer diseases, but it may cause problems. The bone marrow transplant can attack the body can attack the bone marrow, and the patient is sick, at times very sick. A colleague of mine, Dr. Yeshurun at one of the hospitals here, administered CBD to, as you can see here, 46 patients that had a bone marrow transplant, and he followed them for several months, and he saw very, very substantial improvement, and they had essentially no graft versus host disease. So I suppose that cannabidiol will become a drug not only for CBD and for epilepsy, but also for graft versus host disease. As a matter of fact, probably quite a few other diseases as well. What about THC? Again, I will not go into detail, but basically what THC does, it lowers pain. It is used and approved actually for nausea and vomiting. It helps with sleep, and many of those patients that take THC actually take it in order to improve sleep or to make sleep possible. At low doses, it is an anti-anxiety compound, but as we all know, at high doses, we can see completely different effects, and it also increases appetite. So for nearly 20 years since we reported the structures of these compounds, structures which were not known previously, for 20 or 25 years, there was a lot of pharmacological work on these 2 compounds, and we learned from them a lot about the effects of cannabinoids. And hundreds of papers were published on them. One thing that we did not know for many years was the mechanism of action of THC. How does THC act? A group in the US in the 80s found that there is a specific cannabinoid receptor in the brain. And this specific cannabinoid receptor in the brain is found in brain areas that are really typical for the effect that we see. It is found in the basal ganglia. It has a lot to do with movement control. It has been found in the cerebellum, in the hippocampus, in the cerebral cortex. And as a matter of fact, this particular receptor, CB1, is one of the major receptors that we see in the brain, in our body, not only in the brain. Well, we assume that if there is a receptor, it is not there because a plant produces THC. Just we assume that our body produces compounds which activate this receptor. For some peculiar reason, a plant compound binds the same receptor. So we worked for quite a few years actually, and we found in 1992, more than 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we found a new compound, which we call anandamide, that has a structure which is completely different from that of THC. Yet, this compound binds to the receptor, today known as the CB1 receptor, to the same extent as tetrahydrocannabinol. A few years later, we found a second compound, which is closely related to anandamide, and it also binds to the receptor. These two compounds have been investigated thoroughly by many groups, and these two compounds, as I mentioned previously, are involved in a large number of biological systems. They are part of, today we know, of the endocannabinoid system, which consists of two receptors. The second receptor was found a few years later than the previous one. There are two receptors. There are the two major compounds, anandamide and 2-AG, that I showed you the structures previously. There are a few other compounds found in lower amounts which have not been investigated thoroughly, but it seems that these two compounds, which we discovered in the 1990s, anandamide and 2-AG, they are the main compounds involved in the endocannabinoid system. Of course, the enzymes that synthesize endocannabinoids and the enzymes cause the hydrolysis of the endocannabinoids. So these, the compounds and the enzyme today are known as the endocannabinoid system. Of course, THC and cannabis are closely involved. Now, what are the effects that we see that are due to the cannabinoid system? We know today, and there are lots of publications, and I possibly can have a few more slides. I'm just giving a few of the effects that we know. This system is involved in anxiety, appetite, and all these that you can see on this slide, mood, movement, neuroprotection, pain, stress, etc., etc. I'll just give a few examples. Neuroprotection. In collaboration with a colleague of mine, Professor Shahami, we tried to see what happens in the brain after damage, not a major damage but a small damage. And we saw that after such a damage, the brain of the mouse produces 2-AG in very large amount. You can see here the red ball, which you can compare with the control. Huge amounts of 2-AG are synthesized by the brain. Does the brain produce 2-AG because it has been damaged and doesn't know what it does? Or is the production of 2-AG actually a response, a protective response perhaps, about the brain? So we synthesized large amounts of 2-AG and gave it to mice that had undergone brain damage and compared it to mice that had not undergone that damage. And we saw that 2-AG, when administered to the mice, lowers the damage seen. Here you can look at the brains of mice that have received 2AG compared to control animals, and we can see that the damage in the controls is 50% higher than those that that received 2AG. So chances are that at some point, I hope some company will develop 2AG as a compound against brain damage. I don't believe we have any drugs in this area at the moment. I mentioned that there are two receptors. One of them, the CB1, when THC or anandamide bind to the CB1 receptor, they lead to those effects that we know they are associated with cannabis. CB2, by contrast, doesn't do all these things. The CB2 receptor seems to be a protective one, a compound receptor that, when stimulated, actually is leads to protection, and the protection can be in various areas. There are papers on protection of heart problems, atherosclerosis, stroke, liver fibrosis, etc. And I'm under the impression that several of the major companies are working on specific CB2 receptor compounds as for specific diseases. And it is we and many others have published compounds which act on the CB2 receptor alone. And here are two examples from my lab. One of them is HU Hebrew University, HU308, which you can see binds very well to the CB2 receptor, but does not bind to the CB1 receptor. Or the second compound, which is a different one, which is HU910, binds to the CB2 receptor extremely well and rather poorly to the CB1 receptor. I mentioned brain injury, and in brain injury we see quite a lot of different types of damage. One type is has to do with glutamate, cytokines, reactive oxygen intermediates, and these can lead to cell death. Another type of damage is vasoconstriction, and we tested 2AG to see whether it has to do with vasoconstriction. And I mentioned 2AG because we saw one of the previous slides that 2AG is helpful in brain damage. And yes, indeed, it helps with vasoconstriction. It lowers the vasoconstriction in the brain. However, and we were surprised really, however, the total extract of the brain was much better than 2AG alone. So we assumed maybe we have another compound, much more active compound than 2AG, which works on vasoconstriction, vasodilation. And a student of mine, he did his PhD on this topic, looked for compounds or a compound that is better than 2AG in vasodilation. And after quite a few years of work, we were able to identify a compound, the structure that we isolated and elucidated the structure. It is arachidonyl serine. It is very close to anandamide. Both compounds are derivatives of arachidonic acid. This here is the arachidonic acid. Both are bind to, in this case, ethanolamine, and in this case, exactly the same, but with a carboxyl group here. Essentially the same compound as anandamide, but ARA-S, arachidonyl serine, does not bind to the receptors and is much more potent than anandamide in the vasoconstriction. And you can see that the three compounds the anandamide, the 2-HE, and RS, arachidonyl serine, RS, very closely related, but they have different activities. I mentioned head trauma, so we looked at a few additional compounds present in the brain that may act on brain trauma. And we found that RS, as I mentioned, the RS previously, is pretty good in lowering brain trauma. It is as active as 2-AG. Surprisingly, two very closely related compounds, also present in the brain, are essentially inactive. This particular compound, RS, arachidonyl serine that I mentioned, possesses vasoactive and neuroprotective properties resembling those of the cannabinoids. But as I mentioned again, it does not bind to the cannabinoid receptors. I'm not sure how these things work together, as I believe that neuroprotection with cannabinoids, with anandamide, has to do with the CB1 and CB2, but RS does not. So here we may have two different mechanisms leading to the same type of effects. Let me go to another field which cannabinoids are involved. It has been published, and there are several papers on this, that in Greece, Greek peasants seem to have less osteoporosis than peasants in other places, in the north, in Norway, in Germany, in Sweden. And we wanted to know why this happens. And we found that the bone contains a compound. It is also present in the brain, elucidation, which promotes osteoclast apoptosis and increases bone formation. Let me explain. The bones we have do not stay the way they are throughout our life. They are broken down all the time by cells called osteoclasts, and they are at the same time being rebuilt by osteoblasts. Certain diseases, osteoporosis, for example, the osteoclasts work over time, if you wish, and the osteoblast cannot promote enough bone formation. If elucidation was found to lower the effect of osteoclast, it causes apoptosis, and in this way, there is less breaking down of the bone and more bone formation. And you can see here again, this is anandamide, and here is the elucidation, which acts on bones and which causes lowering of the effect of the osteoclast, and it seems to be pretty good in osteoporosis. So another colleague of mine, the late Professor Bob, looked at the activity of elucidation. He caused osteoporosis and osteoporosis-like disease by causing ovariectomy in female mice. And indeed, if one causes ovariectomy and looks at the mice after about 40 days, we see that the bones are, the bone content goes down. But if we start giving elucidation at this point, we can see now that the bones do not continue breaking down. As a matter of fact, recover. Now, most of the drugs that we have for osteoporosis nowadays usually just stop the disease, or they stop to a certain extent the disease. Very few of the drugs, if any at all, cause the formation of the bone. Again, there are quite a few diseases known that are closely related to osteoporosis. There is a disease called Prader-Willi syndrome, which causes bone abnormalities. They are closely related to osteoporosis. Of course, the Prader-Willi symptoms has a lot of other effects, but I'm speaking of the bones alone. And it was found that in Prader-Willi syndrome, we have the body produces lower amounts of allele-serine. So when my colleague, Yossi Tam, who is a specialist in this area, started administering allele-serine to animals that have the Prader-Willi syndrome, they most definitely caused enhancement of bone formation and improvement of the bone disease. Now, all these compounds I mentioned, all these anandamide-like compounds I mentioned, are not very stable. All of them are amides that can be attacked by amidases, and therefore I doubt whether they can be used as drugs on their own. So we prepared a few derivatives. Now we'll go into the chemistry. One of them is the A2671, in which the amide bond is kind of protected, and the enzyme does not attack it as easily as in the compounds I mentioned, or in serine, for example. And indeed, the 678 exhibits high efficacy in reversing the osteoporosis, and it is active in the Prader-Willi syndrome. Let me move to another field. One of the major problems we have in medicine today is that many of the microbes we have antibiotic resistance, and if we don't, we cannot overcome this major problem, we shall probably be back as if we were in the 1930s with microbes that we cannot attack by antibiotics. We try to see whether our body has a way to work against this microbial resistance. And after quite a lot of work, which was done in the lab of Professor Telber in collaboration, we found that methicillin, an antibiotic, against which certain staphylococci or streptococci have become resistant, we can enhance the activity of the antibiotic if we give the antibiotic together with anandamide or RAS, the same compound I mentioned previously, arachidonyl-serine. We found that RAS really can overcome the microbial resistance of these particular microbes. We are looking at many additional microbes at the moment. We're looking at additional compounds, but this may be a very promising field or promising way of overcoming microbial resistance. And here again is anandamide, 2-AG, and RAS, which I mentioned previously. What is the mechanism? How does RAS do that? Well, when microbes are attacked by an antibiotic, one of the ways they can resist is by producing a biofilm. Millions of microbes get together, they form a biofilm, which is not attacked by the antibiotic. The RAS prevents the biofilm formation by altering the surface of the cell without actually killing the bacteria. And let me end with a completely different field, the field of nicotine addiction. Quite a few people that smoke cigarettes or other types of tobacco become addicted to nicotine. And this addiction causes them to smoke, although they know that smoking is not good for them. And we wanted to see whether our body has a way of preventing, lowering this type of this addiction. We found a paper in the literature that a person who was involved in a traffic accident and was addicted to nicotine, after the traffic accident, which he had a brain trauma, he was not addicted anymore. So we thought maybe, just maybe, the brain is producing a compound that blocks the addiction. And so we looked forward and we found a compound which again is very closely related to anandamide. It is a fatty acid. It is a fatty acid bound to this part here, to this forming an amide. And a colleague of ours in Canada went ahead looking whether this compound indeed, those models of addiction is active. As a matter of fact, and I want to stress this again, I mentioned several times that I work with colleagues. All my work is done in collaboration with friends and colleagues. In this case, in the field of addiction, we are a group of 4 labs. In addition to my own lab, a lab in the US, a lab in Canada, and a lab in Italy, and we have worked together. And the lab in Italy actually found the compound from a brain, and the group in Canada worked on the addiction process. Dr. Parker, Canadian, looked at the conditional place preference in an animal model of addiction. Conditional place preference is a relatively simple way of measuring addiction. Mice or rats are given the option to go to food with or go to food with nicotine. At the beginning, they go 50% to one part of to the nicotine containing food, the other, and 50% the food that does not contain nicotine. Well, after some days or probably some weeks, they are addicted to the nicotine, and almost all of them go to the nicotine with food. That's called conditional place preference. And Linda Parker in Canada found that if we give the compound we discovered in the brain, the mice do not get addicted. And they found that the conditional place preference works absolutely in this case. We thought that it might work also with opiates. Well, we were kind of disappointed to see that oleate glycine does not work with opiates, but again, surprisingly, it worked both on nicotine and opiate withdrawal responses. We know that animals, of course, humans that are addicted can undergo withdrawal responses, which sometimes are very, very unpleasant. And we found that oleate glycine eliminates both nicotine and opiate withdrawal responses, which is kind of strange because olein glycine does not work on opiate addiction. But it turned out that the withdrawal and the addiction, there are two different types of response. And today we know that olein glycine works on nicotine addiction, does not work on opioid addiction, but it works on nicotine and opiate withdrawal symptoms. And here is what Linda Parker wrote. Morphine withdrawal reactions were accompanied by suppressed endogenous levels of olein glycine in different parts of the brain. Well, olein glycine is again an amide, and as I mentioned before, amides can be easily attacked by amidases. So we decided to, again, try to suppress this enzyme reaction by having a metal group not far from the amide. And so we synthesized the compound. This is olein glycine, and this is an olein glycine with a metal group. So it becomes alanine, olein alanine. And this compound turned out to be more active for a longer period and then olein glycine itself. So we found that olein alanine is not only more stable, but it's also more potent anti-withdrawal molecule than olein glycine. And I am under the impression that this compound may or should become a drug. Well, as I mentioned before, on the basis of what I've been telling you, we assume that the exogenous administration of olein glycine or olein alanine may be beneficial for the prevention of nicotine addiction and nicotine and opiate withdrawal. Well, let me summarize what I've been talking about. The endocannabinoids are involved in a large number of physiological processes, and THC, which is a plant cannabinoid, just mimics their actions. CBD derivatives may lead to wide spectrum of novel drugs, and the cannabinoid-like compounds may lead to better understanding of biological processes as well as novel drugs, and CB2 specific agonists may lead to a wide spectrum of novel drugs, may be part of a general protective system. And I want to thank my collaborators in Israel. These are fellows in my lab. There are many other labs, other professors in Jerusalem that I collaborate. I mentioned my work with Professor Bar, Professor Shohami, and some in other academic institutes in Israel. And I work with a lot of collaboration with some road from the UK, Aberdeen, Roger Pertwee. You can see the names of many of these, and I thank them, and I thank you.